Good day, everyone. Welcome to another Live with Kevin today, another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you didn't know that, you can see it over my shoulder. What that means is you get more than Kevin today, which is probably to your great advantage, I suppose. I'm excited to have you with me today. So here's the thing. If you're with me live, what I hope that you will do is go into the comments whatever social channel you're on and say hello. Tell us where you're located. I do that because I'd like to know where you're located, but also I want to get you used to using your fingers because I hope that you will interact with us during this conversation. So imagine that you were joining my guest and I around a table. We were having a cup of coffee, a glass of water, or whatever. And if you were listening to us have a conversation, if you had a comment, you would share it. If you had a question, you would ask it. If you had an idea, you would offer it, right? So why not do that here? Why not do exactly the same thing? Just because we happen to be virtual doesn't mean we can't do that. And when you do, you'll be more engaged. You'll get more value from this. We'll have a better conversation. And eventually, this will be a better episode for the podcast as well. And if you happen to be watching this later on one of these social channels, you can still make a comment and share your thoughts or send me a note if you've got a question or a comment as well. So that's what I hope that you will do. But this will ultimately be on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast coming out in early January. So what I want to do now is do the open that will be for the podcast itself. So Marissa, this is the break for you in 3, 2, 1. Being strategic. Most every executive will say it's a critical skill, but many can't describe what it looks like very well at all. Today, we're going to help you define it and do it more effectively with the help of a marvelous returning guest expert. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast in the future, you could be with us for these live streams. And if you want to find out about when those take place, so you can join us for those, get this kind of great information and ideas sooner, you can do that by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to get connected, to get insight about what's going on with the podcast, maybe get some inside scoop, but also to find out when these lives are happening. So today's episode is brought to you by our Remarkable Masterclasses. Pick from our 13 important life and leadership skills to help you become more effective, productive, and confident while overcoming some of a leader's toughest challenges. You can learn more and sign up at remarkablemasterclass.com. And so with that, I'm going to bring in our guest. Here he is. He is a returning guest. He was with us the first time. I looked it up this morning in August of 2018, which means that he and I have both been at this for quite a while. Let me tell you a little bit about Rich Horwath, who is our guest. You can, if you're watching, you can now see him. Rich Horwath is the founder and CEO of Strategic Thinking Institute, where he is a strategy facilitator, advisor, and coach to executive leadership teams. He is a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestselling author of 8 books on strategic thinking, including his newest, Strategic, the skill to set direction, create advantage, and achieve executive excellence. He is rated as the #1 keynote speaker on strategy at national events, including the Society for Human Resource Management Strategy Conference. He's helped more than 250,000 people to develop strategic thinking and planning capabilities over the last 20 years in pursuit of his vision to teach the world to be strategic. Rich, welcome back. Welcome to the first time you're doing this with me live.
Kevin, great to be back with you. And it's hard to believe it's been that many years, but you look great. You sound great. And I'm excited for our conversation.
Well, I will take the compliments and just say thank you. I am excited to have you back. 8 books in the same general topic area. So I'd love to know, why is that your vision to teach the world to be strategic? Like, what's the journey that leads you to that vision? Like, how did you end up here?
Yeah. So, about 25 years ago, and again, now I'm really dating myself. I was actually working as a strategy facilitator for a big company, and we had a break at one of the during one of the meetings, and one of the managers came up and said, Rich, I just had my performance review, and my boss told me I'm too tactical. I need to be more strategic. And he said, how do you do that? And so I said, let me think
He's
about
not
that
the
a little.
first one to ask that question, right?
Exactly, Kevin. You know better than anybody from a leadership expertise standpoint. So, yeah, so I did some research, and back then, most of the books on strategy from Michael Porter, C.K. Prahalad, folks like that, were really around corporate strategy. How do you develop strategy for an overall business, for a corporation, across countries, across industries? And so there wasn't.
And not only for organizations, but for big organizations, right?
Yes,
Like
exactly.
multi-divisional, multinational, et cetera, right?
Right, that's exactly right. And so what dawned on me at the time was there really wasn't a roadmap for the individual manager, individual leader, day in and day out to be strategic, to be good at strategy, to allocate resources effectively, to try to create competitive advantage and create great value for their customers. So that really was my epiphany to say, hey, this could be something that would bring value to people. And over the years, to your point, the vision is really to teach the world to be strategic, because I really do believe in my core that if people can use their time and their talent as effectively as possible, it's going to bring them the greatest satisfaction, and it's going to bring the people around them the greatest value. So that's really been my hope, and I've tried to do that over the years with the books and articles and things like that. And then again, really appreciate the opportunity to share my experiences with folks like yourself and your listeners.
So it's so funny because when I was reading in the beginning of the book, you what I often do, and people that follow my writing will often find that I will take a word that we're going to talk about, and I'll look it up, right? I'll use a definition, and I've done this for the word strategy, and the dictionary does a woefully bad job of it. And you talk about that early in the book. So since we've got you here, and since I in the open said that everyone says we ought to be strategic, but no one can really tell us what that really means, why don't we start there? So from your perspective, and because I love your definition, like, let's just start here. What is strategy?
Yeah. So to your point, Kevin, over the last 20 years, there's 91 different definitions of strategy. So we can see why leaders are having trouble if there's 91 different definitions. So I define strategy as the allocation of resources through a unique system of activities to achieve a goal. So really, if we boil it down, is strategy is how you plan to achieve your goal.
So that gets at one of the things that I want to get at, which in a minute I want to talk about strategy versus goals. And I know that that's one of the things that where people mess up here, or they have make mistakes. So let's talk for a second about, since often as leaders we don't know what we mean, or we don't know how to see what strategy looks like, or being strategic looks like. What are some of the big mistakes or misconceptions that you have seen over the years? We could probably spend our entire time on that. I don't want to do that, but like, hit a couple of the high points here that might sort of get people who are listening to say, "Oh yeah, that's what I was thinking, and I need to make sure I stay around."
Yeah, well, if you read Wall Street Journal on a regular basis, you'll see oftentimes people saying our strategy is to be number one. Our strategy is to grow by $1 billion. Our strategy, and we use numbers a lot. And the reality is, strategy typically isn't a number. Strategy is how are you going to get to that number. So that's one of the big transitions I see, is people going from the number to how are you going to get to the number. So that's probably the biggest one. The second one I would say is people thinking that strategy is just doing the same things in the same ways that we've always done them. And then, that Einstein definition of insanity, where we're doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So, strategy, if you're not doing anything different or anything unique, it's not going to be a strategy. So I'd say those probably the two biggest ones, is confusing numbers with strategy, and then doing the same things and thinking that strategy.
I love that. So that leads me to where I wanted to go next. And you've already really said it, that strategy isn't a goal. So in the book, one of the things that I found really interesting and useful is what you, and I don't know how you pronounce this. I'm going to call it the GHOST framework, GOST, no H, GOST framework, because it helps us hook those two things together, strategy and goals. So walk us through the ghost framework, if you would.
Sure. And yeah, and you pronounce that perfectly. The reason I like to use goals, objectives, strategies, tactics when we're developing plans is because those are the oldest planning terms in history. They date back about 2,500 years to China. People like Sun Tzu, the Chinese general philosopher. Many folks out there probably read the book The Art of War. And so those terms are really pretty concretely defined. And so when we think about a plan, Kevin, whether it's a plan for your business, for my business, maybe it's a plan for a community food bank that we volunteer for on the weekends. Any plan is going to answer two questions. What are we trying to achieve? And how are we going to do it? And so the GHOST framework gives us a simple way to answer those two questions. Goals and objectives answer the what question. What are we trying to achieve? The goal is generally what we're trying to achieve. Let's say reaching the peak of the mountain. The objective is going to be more specific and quantifiable. So if the goal is to get to the top of the mountain, the objective maybe ascend 3,000 feet each day for 4 days till we hit that 12,000-foot summit. So goals and objectives, to your point, and I'm glad you brought it up, those really answer that what question. What are we trying to achieve? Strategy and tactics then are answering the how question. How are we going to achieve it? So strategy is how generally, maybe we go straight up the mountain. We have to zigzag. We have to go around the other side. And then tactics are going to be the specific tangible things that get us there. So in this example, maybe we need ropes, pickaxes, maybe we need a boat to go around the other side, those specific tangible things. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that actually is the number one challenge that people face, is they mistake goals for strategy. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
So I think that people are getting this idea of what versus how, at least I hope they are, but I'd like you to say a little bit more, like using your example, maybe giving us a different example of objectives, 3,000, ascend 3,000 feet today,
Yep.
versus tactic, which you said, I got to have pickaxes, et cetera. So can you give us another example? Help us make sure that we're clear about the difference between the objective part and the tactic part.
Yeah, so good point. So let's so again, when we think about the objective, the reason we want to have a quantified number there and a time frame is, as a leader, you need a way to hold people accountable for their progress. And so the objective really acts as that trigger for you as a leader, so that when you sit down with your direct report, we can say, Marcia, you told me that last month, let's say Marcia is our HR director. So her goal was to retain high performance employees. The objective she might have would be to retain 90% of people rated 4s and 5s, so highly rated people, by the end of Q4 2023. So that was her objective. The tactics then, so great point, Kevin, to your point, the tactics that Marcia would use might be things like, we're going to change the compensation plan to include a year-end bonus for 360 reviews. We're going to have a ratings chart that looks at 3 competencies that go to employee retention. And we're going to evaluate you on a scale of 1 to 3 in those areas. So again, to your point, the objective is really our benchmark for progress. How are we going to gauge progress? And then the tactics are going to be the specific things that help us achieve that progress.
I love that. Thank you for taking us a little deeper, and you can see, if you're watching, that I'm taking notes. Those of you that are with us live, if you've got a question, a comment, feel free to share it. Of course, I have read some of your other work, clearly, when you were on the show before, and I've read quite a bit about strategy over time. Certainly isn't my greatest strength, and so one of the reasons why I like to read about it. The thing that I think sets this book apart is the piece that you call the strategic fitness system. And it's got 4 parts. You think about it like a compass, I suppose. So I'd like you to just sort of lay out the 4 parts of the strategic fitness system, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
Excellent, Kevin. So I have to give credit to you. One of the things I know in our chats in the past, in following your work, you're a big believer in learning as not a one-time event, but a process, an ongoing process. And so I subscribe to your theory completely that learning is not going to be a one-time event. Any of us that have been to a one-time event, we can take away a couple things, but that's not going to really help us have sustained excellent performance or remarkable performances as you describe. And so what I've tried to do with the strategic fitness system is really say, as a leader, here are the 4 areas based on my research with thousands of leaders. Here are the 4 areas that you really need to cover: strategy, leadership, organization, and communication. And to me, the fitness part of that is, and we think about fitness, and you talked about definitions earlier, which I love. Fitness is really the ability of an organism, a person, to adapt to their environment successfully. And so when I think about strategic fitness, I really think about a leader's ability to continuously learn from their environment and interactions, and then transform those learnings into insights which create value for them and their customers. So that's really what the idea of strategic fitness is about. It's a way, as you said, a compass to navigate our business, continuously learn from our interactions so that we're constantly elevating our collective understanding of the business in ways we can provide superior value.
And well, there's so much there that I'd like to unpack, but I need us to stay with the 4 pieces of this fitness system. Obviously, strategy is a part of that. We've talked some about that. We probably will more before we're done. So let's talk about the other 3 for a second, right? So there's the strategy fitness, but then there's leadership fitness.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean, or what are the pieces in that from your perspective?
Well, again, compliments to you based on a lot of your work. You go back even to the book from Bud to Boss, which is a great book for folks maybe who haven't read it recently. I definitely recommend it as a refresh. But you do a great job in there of defining key terms like remarkable, like leadership, and I agree with you. I think to me, a leader is somebody who sets direction, serves others to achieve a common purpose, a common goal, a common destination. And so leadership fitness is really about how are you as a leader getting better? We're not going to get better just by existing. We have to think about, we have to take courses, we have to learn from other people like this podcast that you produce. We've got to be active learners. And so leadership fitness is really, how are you learning as a leader to set direction and serve the people that work with you and for you?
So I think that, again, most people would probably, if I said we're going to talk about communication fitness, which is the 4th of the 4, that's going to be pretty straightforward. But when we talk about the phrase organization fitness, what do you mean there? Like how does that connect with this overall idea of strategy that we're talking about today?
Well, for a lot of the folks out there, I think you'll get this analogy. If you think about a tree or a bush in your backyard, and after years and years, if you haven't pruned it at all, it can be a little bit of an unsightly mess. There's branches and leaves and twigs going all different directions.
Hey, stay out of my yard. Stay out of my yard, Rich.
Exactly. So we know that every few years we've got to prune some of those dead branches, some of those unsightly branches. And when we do that, we actually create new growth in the tree or in that bush. And so in organization fitness is really, are you tending to the structure, the systems, and the process and the purpose of your organization? You can't just set that when you start out as a company and then 30 years later just say, well, what does it look like now? We've got to actively, similar to a leader who's continually developing themselves, their skill sets, their knowledge. An organization needs to be tended, needs to be pruned, needs to be grown in a thoughtful way as well.
I love that analogy, and and you talk about that in the book. I think that if we extend that analogy a little bit more, it's very useful. So, like, I do have a bush in our backyard that looks fine, but it's really big,
Mhm.
and it looks fine, but it isn't what my wife wants. She wants it a lot smaller. And this winter, when is the right time for this particular bush, we're going to cut it down smaller. And guess
Mhm.
what? The first year, it ain't going to be very good. It ain't going to
Right.
look very good next year for a while. But if we'd have trimmed it, pruned it, shaped it, tended to it
Mhm.
every year,
Mhm.
or even every other year in this case, it'd be way better. Not
Yep.
only would be more enjoyment, it'd be healthier, it would be more vibrant, et cetera, et cetera. Point that I'm making is that a lot of times organizations, when they actually have, when they find that they're in a crunch and they have to do this pruning,
Mhm.
shifting, changing, then it's really painful. It's like cutting back the bush a lot, as
Yep.
opposed to a little bit of work all the time. I really love the analogy. You want to add any more to that?
No, I think the way that the way you just shared it is perfect. And again, I think, and again, I love the word you use the word remarkable in your book from Bud to Boss, and you use it obviously for your podcast and for lots of things that you do. Um, I'd actually, I'd love for your thoughts, Kevin, around when you think what makes a remarkable organization in your experience. What would be a couple things that you've seen that help organizations, to your point, not get unsightly and overgrown, but really be tighter, stronger, more efficient on a regular basis? Anything from your perspective?
Well, I think a couple. I'll just really sort of echo and sort of lean into a couple of things we've already talked about. One
Okay.
is process, right? You use the word system.
Mhm.
Use it whether we use the word system, whether we use the word process. The idea that um, thinking about what we want to be
Mhm.
all the time, not
Yes.
once in a while, but like really um, being cognizant of what we want the organization to be. How do we want to serve the people in that organization? How do we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to engage them, excite them, help them not only be accountable but want to be accountable? All of those sorts of things. I think
Mhm.
that's certainly part of it, is to think about it as a process. And I think the other one is, and we certainly talked about this, is we've got to have, not only do we need to have a what, a goal, but we need to have a why, right?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so we've talked about in the Ghost framework about the what and the how, and they're both critical. But I think to get to remarkable, so that people are bringing their best selves to work most all of the time, we
Mhm.
really have to have um, a clear why,
Yes.
and that it's connected to people's individual purposes, such that meaning is created for the work. Since work is such a huge part of our waking hours,
Right.
waking lives, that if people are walking through that sort of zombie like,
Yeah.
then we're not adding any value for them. Work isn't adding value for them other than a paycheck. And so it's having a clear organizational why that's tied to people's individual purposes in ways that's meaningful. We can do that. I think we're heading in the right direction. So it just really sits in front of what we're talking about here, about the what and the how.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the way you phrase that. I'd be interested because you work with leaders day in and day out. Have you noticed any tips or techniques that would help a leader? Because what you described, I think, is the crucial missing step, is connecting the organizational why to the individual why. Any things that you, because I honestly am interested in understanding, is there a way that you've seen, or a tip or technique to help people make that connection between organizational and individual?
Yeah, and I think that here's the answer, or at least my answer,
Yeah.
and that is that for the most part, um, senior leaders, business owners like you and I,
Mhm.
with maybe a small leadership team or whatever, we like sort of come back, or in big organizations, we come back from the mountain with the why,
Right.
and or whatever the
Yeah.
situation is, right? And that's fine, but it can't be a personal why until it's communicated. But the mistake that we make is we tell everybody the organizational why, and we might even tell them why that's important to us, but we don't give them space to build that connection. So from my perspective, I want people to create their why, knowing the organizational one, let them find the linkage. Their why doesn't have to match mine.
Yep.
And the mistake that we make is we try to get everyone to understand and agree with our why, rather than our job as leaders to help them find theirs. And if when they find theirs, there isn't a great connection to our organization, then the best thing for everyone is to help them find a new place, which may or may not be in our organization, right? Or if the organization is large enough, chances are we can help find them that place. But if the organization is smaller, you just may not be able to, right? And that doesn't have to be anyone's fault. But the reality is that as leaders, we need to spend more time helping people find theirs than telling them what ours is and assuming everyone thinks about it the same way we do.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, going from force feeding to discovery, like
discovery is the right word. Discovery is absolutely the right word.
Well, giving people the space to discover that, I think that's a really powerful concept. Thanks for sharing that.
I don't know if we do it as well all the time as I'd like to. You and I were talking about that before we went live. Right. Right. So the other thing that I really want us to talk about for a couple of minutes is the idea that you talk about there being strategy habits. And I'm a big believer in habits. Like there's a difference between a skill and a habit. Like I can have something in a toolkit. If I don't ever pull it out, like what's the point? It's just taking up space in the toolkit, right? So, and making it heavier to carry, I suppose. So my question is, what about strategy habits? What are a couple of them that people can have as takeaways while they're waiting for their copy of your new book, Strategy, the skill to set direction, create advantage, and achieve executive excellence? Talk about habits for a second.
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right. There is a big difference between a skill that we use occasionally and a habit, something that's ingrained from a behavioral standpoint, day in and day out. And when it comes to strategy, I'd say probably the number one habit I see in the top performers at any organization, any industry, is the ability to commit time to think. The reality is we live in such an action-oriented world that I think people almost feel guilty if we take time and we're not physically doing something, but we're stepping back out of the day-to-day to think about what are we doing? To your point earlier, why are we doing it? And how could we do it differently or better? To me, that's probably the number one habit, is just taking time, and you've actually got to schedule it in your calendar, because it doesn't happen otherwise.
It will not. We've all heard the metaphor of the big blocks or the big stones and the smaller stones and the sand and the water. Like you can't put the big stone in at the end. Like it's got to go first, right? You've got to schedule this time for sure. 100%.
Right, exactly. So that's probably the biggest one, is carving out, scheduling time to think about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how could you do it differently or better. And I'd say the second one, we talked about strategy as allocation of resources through unique system activity. One of the habits I've seen, again, from great leaders is they don't wait to reallocate resources, time, people, projects, budget until the end of the year. If we're doing strategy once a year, we are not going to be maximizing our potential. We're not going to be strategic. So the other habit I see that's powerful is on a monthly or quarterly basis, sitting down for 20 minutes and saying, what should I stop doing that I'm investing my time in today? What should I be doing less of? What should I be doing more of? And what should I start doing? Those four simple questions are
say the four questions again. If people are if they're multitasking, which we really can't do anyway. So stop everybody. Stop the thinking about something else for a second. What are the four questions again?
So we want to think about where we're spending our time, our attention, our budget, our activities each week. And we want to ask ourselves, what should we stop doing that's no longer adding value, but taking time? What should we do less of? Number two, what should we do more of? Where could we add greater value and spend more time? And then the fourth one is, what should we start doing that would add value to ourselves or the people we work with that we're not currently doing today?
Those are four fabulous questions. They're fabulous questions to ask ourselves. And I would say they're fabulous questions to ask your team as well.
Exactly.
I'm just going to give you all a thought because I work hard at making that thinking time. I do better at it sometimes than others, but I'm about ready in, I don't know, 30 hours or so, something like that, to get on an airplane. And I've got a couple of long flights and then a couple of long flights several days later. And when I get on airplanes, here's what I used to think. Airplanes are awesome times to do exactly this because, for one thing, you didn't have any internet and you didn't have any other distractions. Well, now they gave us all that crap on the airplane and we don't need it. Like, what we need to do is shut all that stuff down and do this.
Yes.
And not all of us fly all the time, and I don't fly as much as I once did, thank you to COVID and some of the strategies in our business. And yet that is an example of time when I can say, I'm going to use that time to think and read. That's what I'm going to do with those hours. Now, that shouldn't be the only time we spend doing those activities, but it's a place where we can now, unfortunately, sort of go back into our routine of doing pretty much anything we could do before we left the office or even the airport. And yet it's an intentional place where we can do that. We need to be intentional about it. 100%. I completely agree. Is there anything, Rich? I mean, we could have a long conversation about almost any of the individual things we've talked about. Is there anything specifically that you wish I would have asked you that I didn't, or that we didn't talk about?
No, it's been a great conversation. The one thing I'd love for your thoughts on, Kevin, is you used the word remarkable. We talked about it a moment ago a lot, and it's a powerful word. I'd be interested in, and you use it in reference to leaders quite often. I'd be interested in your thoughts on, do you see that word remarkable or extraordinary extending to strategy? And when you see leaders developing plans, what's been your sense of that concept of remarkable in the world of strategy?
Well, if we go back to looking up words, right? The word remarkable really means something worth remarking on, something worth noting. And so I would actually say that the best strategies are remarkable because they allow us to bring insight, unique insight, to help us deliver something in a unique way compared to others. And so, I mean, I would say it's a perfect word to use with strategy. And if we have a strategy that's sort of ho-hum, then it's probably not going to be a very effective strategy at the end of the day. If we have a strategy that we as a team can look at and say, that's remarkable, that's valuable, that's something I can get behind, then we've probably really got something. So Rich, before we go, a couple things that I like to ask everyone that joins us. And the first one is this: what do you do for fun? Forget strategy for a second. What do you do for fun, Rich?
Well, I like to hike. Actually, we've got some good preserves, and when we travel, whether it's to Arizona or California, that's always number one on the list. I think we spend so much time sitting behind desks or standing behind desks today that being in nature, to me, really is a great catalyst for that thinking. And actually, some of my best ideas, some of my book ideas, have come from long hikes, whether on vacation or near the house. So that's probably the main thing, is just being out in nature and really just absorbing that and providing that mental space.
And I mentioned this before, and for those of you that are watching, you can see behind Rich that what's behind Rich is not an image, but it is his actual office filled with bookshelves. So Rich, what are you reading these days? What's something you've read recently?
Well, one of the more fascinating books I've been reading is called The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin. And Kevin, he says a lot of the things that you've talked about and I've talked about to some extent too. Just this idea of we can all be masters of different skills and domains if we commit ourselves to them. And he's a really interesting person. He was a world chess champion as a teenager, and there was actually a movie written based on his story called Searching for Bobby Fischer. And but then he stopped playing chess, and he said, what other domains do I want to explore and be expert in? And so he became a world martial arts champion in his later years, in his 20s. And
Most
so,
people would not think, oh, I'm going to go from being a chess champion
right,
to being a martial arts champion.
right. So it's just, so what he does in the book very, very nicely is he talks about how do we learn effectively and efficiently in the areas that are most important to us. So that's probably been one of the more fascinating books I've been reading lately.
Being strategic, perhaps even in doing that. So now, speaking of being strategic, where do you want to point us, Rich? Where can we learn more about you and your business and this book? Like, where do you want to point people so they can learn more?
Yeah. So again, for a lot of free resources, videos, white papers, infographics, I like to provide a lot of free content. So if you visit strategyskills.com, so strategyskills.com, there's lots of great free resources there. There's discussion guides. There's lots of things that can help you tomorrow become a little bit better strategically.
Awesome. And there's also a website for the book, right? Strategic-book.com.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, wherever fine books are sold, everybody, you can get your copy of Strategic by Rich Horwath. Thank you so much, Rich, for being here. Before we go, though, everybody, I have a question I ask you every single episode. I'll ask it now. Now what? What are you going to do with what you just received? So I think I've taken as many notes personally today as I've taken in a while on one of our episodes. I've got all sorts of things that I'm going to do, that I'm going to think about, that I'm going to use. And I hope that you will do the same. Maybe you're going to ask those 4 questions. What am I going to do? What am I going to stop, do less of, do more of, or start? Maybe you're going to just figure out how you're going to put more time in your calendar to stop and think. Maybe you're going to think about how you're going to think about doing some pruning in your organization. It isn't necessarily pruning people, but
Right.
pruning the organization in a way to help you all grow a little more effectively. I don't know what that is for you, but I do know that unless you intentionally think about what you're going to use from what you learned, then you won't get nearly as much from this than you would have otherwise. So, Rich, again, thank you so much for coming back to the show after a 5-year hiatus. I'm glad to have had you, and thanks for the time and the insights today.
Thanks, Kevin. Great to be with you today.
And so, everybody, if you found this useful, please share this episode with someone else. And if you have been with us before, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And feel free to let others know that they ought to join us, or you know how to hit the rating and reviewing and starring. You know what to do wherever it is that you watch your podcast. Do that. And make sure you come back with us next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.